It was the year 1931, and the Gulf Coast of the United States burned under a relentless sun that made the sand almost impossible to tread. That March morning, when the heat already made the air shimmer over the dunes, Carmen woke with a premonition that chilled her spine despite the suffocating heat. It wasn't the cries of hunger from her 5 children that woke her, although that sound was as familiar as her own breath. It wasn't the crash of waves breaking on the black rocks of the beach, a sound she had known since she was a girl. It was something different, something that didn't belong to that forgotten stretch of Bayou Bend. A deep, metallic creak, as if some giant creature was breathing with difficulty. A moan that came from the sea and made the packed dirt floor of her miserable shack vibrate. Carmen rose from the rough wooden platform where she slept with her children huddled like animals seeking protection. The youngest, Peter, just 10 months old, cried too weakly. A cry that had no strength left, the cry of a child who hadn't had enough milk for days. Beside him, wrapped in rags that were once sheets, were the other 4. Raphael, the eldest at 11, pretended to be asleep, but Carmen saw his tense shoulders, knew the boy was awake, carrying a burden no child should carry. The other 3, girls aged 7, 5, and 3, breathed with difficulty in the stifling heat of the early morning. Frances, Audrey, and little Daisy, 3 mouths she couldn't feed, 3 pairs of eyes that looked at her with a trust that broke her heart. It had been 7 months since the sea had swallowed her husband, John. 7 months since an unannounced storm had capsized his fishing skiff and dragged him to the bottom, along with the nets that were their only means of support. John was strong as a bull, his arms capable of pulling nets full of fish for hours without tiring. But the sea respects neither strength nor courage. The sea takes what it wants and returns only silence and widowhood. Now Carmen was alone, completely alone, in a world that had no pity for women without husbands and without money. John's fishing skiff had been lost too, or at least that's what they said. Carmen suspected someone had found it and kept it for themselves, but she had no way to prove anything. All that remained of him was a faded cotton shirt hanging on a nail on the rough clay wall, stained with salt and sweat, a fabric ghost that still held his scent. And then there was Colonel Anthony, the owner of all the land around the village, the man who controlled the fishing skiffs, the general store, and practically the lives of everyone who lived on that forgotten strip of coast. Colonel Anthony wasn't a colonel by military rank, but by power, one of those men who declared themselves owners of everything and whom no one dared to challenge. He was a man with thick hands and cold eyes, who smoked expensive cigars while watching the village children starve. 3 days earlier, he had cornered Carmen near the communal well, his enormous shadow blocking the afternoon sun. He had come to collect John a debt that had magically grown after his death, inflated by illogical interest, by ropes and hooks that now rested at the bottom of the ocean along with her husband's body. Colonel Anthony didn't want the money she didn't have. Carmen knew that. What he wanted was the land where her shack stood. He wanted to drive her out. He wanted to see her on her knees begging. He wanted her dignity broken at his feet. The ultimatum had been clear, pronounced with that drawn-out, venomous voice he used when he was being cruel. You have until tomorrow's sunset to pay everything your deceased husband owed, Carmen. Every last cent. If you don't pay, I'll kick you and that pack of brats off this land. You'll sleep on the sand with the crabs. He had spit on the ground after speaking, a thick glob that remained there in the sand like a mark of contempt. Carmen had clenched her fists until her nails dug into the flesh of her palms, but she hadn't said anything. What could she say? She didn't have a single cent. She didn't have a seed to plant. She had nothing but desperate love for her children and the certainty that the world was unjust and cruel. Can you imagine that? Can you feel the weight of that despair? To know that your children are slowly starving and you have absolutely nothing to offer them, no hope, no path, just the emptiness of tomorrow approaching like a death sentence? Carmen gritted her teeth and left the shack. The air outside was heavy, humid, laden with that smell of salt mixed with mud from the nearby mangroves. The moon was still in the sky, a waning moon that barely illuminated the dunes. But there was something different in the air, something that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The metallic creak came again, louder now, accompanied by a deep crack that echoed across the deserted beach. Carmen walked toward the sound, her bare feet sinking into the sand still warm from the day before. The dawn mist began to form over the sea, that thick fog that came from the ocean on warmer days, and covered everything with a white, ghostly veil. She walked faster, her heart beating erratically, not knowing exactly what she expected to find. Wreckage of some fishing skiff? Stranded fish she could gather before others saw? Anything would do. Any crumb the sea threw her way would be welcome. But when the mist parted for an instant, what Carmen saw made her stop completely, frozen in place, with her heart rising to her throat. There, stranded on the golden sand of the beach like an impossible apparition, was a ship. It wasn't a broken fishing skiff. It wasn't a fishing boat destroyed by the storm. It was a real ship, enormous, painted a white that gleamed even in the weak light of dawn, with tall masts and a structure that seemed to have come out of a dream or a nightmare. The ship was perfectly intact, beached almost delicately on the sand, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. There were no signs of a wreck, no broken wood, no torn sails. It was simply there, silent and imposing, completely out of place on that poor and forgotten beach. On the hull, golden letters, somewhat faded by the salt, read Morning Star. Carmen felt a violent shiver run through her entire body. It was a ship for rich people, the kind that transported gentlemen from the capital, people she had only seen from afar when they passed through the village in their luxurious carriages. What was a ship like that doing there, abandoned, with no one around? Where was the crew? Where were the owners? The silence around the ship was absolute and unnatural, as if even the seagulls were afraid to approach. Carmen took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to flee, to run back to the safety of the shack and pretend she had never seen it. This wasn't for her. This belonged to the world of the rich, the powerful, a world that only brought misfortune to poor folk like her. But then the image of her 5 children returned to her mind with brutal force. Peter crying from hunger, that weak, sharp cry that never stopped. Raphael pretending to be strong when he was just a frightened child. The girls with their bellies swollen from malnutrition, their deep-set eyes that seemed too big for their thin faces. And Colonel Anthony's voice echoing in her ears like a death knell. Until tomorrow's sunset. What did she have to lose? She was already condemned. She was already dead, just hadn't fallen yet. This ship, this impossible and frightening thing, was the only door that had opened for her in 7 months of absolute misery. Perhaps there was something inside, something of value that she could trade, sell, or pawn in the neighboring town. A thick rope, a piece of metal, tools, anything. Carmen took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the salty dawn air, and approached the ship's white hull. A rope ladder hung from the side, swaying gently in the sea breeze like an invitation or a trap. Carmen looked around one last time, making sure she was alone on the beach. The village still slept. No one woke so early. not even the most dedicated fisherman. She gripped the rough rope with her calloused hands, hands that had scrubbed clothes until they bled, that had gathered shellfish from sharp rocks, that had buried a husband too young to die. She began to climb. The rope was strong, stronger than any she had ever touched, and smelled of tar and salt. Each step was an effort, her muscles protesting after days of eating only coarse flour mixed with water. When she finally set foot on the ship's deck, the smell hit her like a punch. It wasn't just the smell of the sea or wet wood. It was an intense, sickly sweet perfume, the scent of exotic flowers she didn't know, the smell of expensive varnished wood, spilled wine, and rotting food. But beneath it all was something more sinister, a metallic, sweetish odor she recognized immediately because she had smelled it before when they helped prepare bodies for burial in the village, the unmistakable scent of old, dry blood. The deck was a scene of luxurious chaos. There were velvet cushions scattered across the polished wooden floor, stained with seawater and something darker. A long table of fine wood was overturned, with expensive porcelain plates broken around it, some still with remnants of food clinging to them. Crystal goblets were strewn everywhere, some still upright, others rolling slowly with the almost imperceptible sway of the stranded ship. It was a party abruptly interrupted, a desperate escape, a scene of terror frozen in time. Carmen stepped carefully among the wreckage, her bare feet feeling the smooth, expensive wood beneath her calloused soles. She had never walked on anything like it, nothing so smooth and well-crafted. It was like walking on a surface that didn't belong to the world she knew. She saw the main cabin door ajar, a rectangle of deep darkness on the ship's pristine white wall. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her own ears, a drum of fear and adrenaline that wouldn't stop. Should she go in? Every instinct screamed at her to turn back and flee that cursed place. But necessity was stronger than fear. Her children's hunger was more real than any ghost. Carmen pushed the door slowly, and it opened with a sharp creak that echoed through the ship's silence like a scream. The cabin's interior was even more opulent than the deck. The floor was covered with a thick carpet that muffled her steps, a carpet with intricate designs in colors she didn't even know existed. The walls gleamed with a golden varnish that reflected the dim light entering through the door. In the center of the cabin was a gigantic bed, larger than the entire area where her family slept, covered with silk sheets that looked like frozen water. The sheets were completely undone and thrown on the floor, stained with something dark that formed sinister patterns on the light fabric. It looked as though someone had fled in the middle of the night, escaping something terrible. A dark wooden chest lay open in the corner, with expensive men's and women's clothes strewn around, as if they had been hastily searched, or as if someone had looked for something specific and didn't care about the mess they left behind. And then Carmen saw something that made her blood run cold and her stomach churn. On the floor, half hidden under a fallen piece of silk, was a small, shiny black leather shoe, a well-made child's shoe, the kind only children from wealthy families wore to church parties. Just one shoe, alone, abandoned there like an unanswered question. Where was the child who wore that shoe? Where was its mate? The image of Peter, her 10-month-old baby, always barefoot because she didn't even have money for straw sandals, invaded her mind with painful force. Carmen forced herself to look away from the shoe, feeling hot tears sting her eyes. She couldn't think about it now, couldn't let her imagination lead her to dark places. She had come here to find something that could save her family, and that's what she was going to do. Her gaze swept across the cabin until it landed on a polished wooden desk against the wall. Unlike the rest of the room, the desk was relatively intact. On it was an overturned ink pen, a pool of black ink spread across the expensive wood, and a thick book bound in dark brown leather. Carmen approached slowly. It was a logbook, one of those books where ship captains wrote about their voyages. It lay open to the last page, the ink still fresh in some parts, as if it had been written just hours ago. Carmen couldn't read very well, only her name and a few simple words that the village priest had taught her when she was a child. But she recognized letters, recognized when something was written in haste and desperation. The letters on the page were uneven, smudged, written by a violently trembling hand. She needed someone who could read, but there was no one. Her children couldn't read, they were illiterate like her. But then she remembered Raphael, her 11-year-old eldest son. The priest had started teaching the boy a few months ago, before John died and everything fell apart. Raphael knew a few words. Perhaps he could decipher it. Carmen picked up the book carefully, feeling the weight of the leather in her hands. She was about to leave the cabin when her gaze was drawn to a smaller door at the back of the room, a door that probably led to the ship's galley. Hunger was more urgent than curiosity. If there was a diary, there were rich people here, and rich people always had food. Lots of food. Carmen crossed the cabin and opened the kitchen door. What she saw made her let out an involuntary gasp of shock and relief. The kitchen was a treasure trove of obscene abundance. There was food everywhere, more food than she had seen in her entire life combined. Cans of preserves stacked on shelves, cans with colorful labels written in foreign languages she didn't know, Portuguese sardines, peaches and syrup, canned meat, condensed milk. There were sacks of fine wheat flour, white as snow, completely different from the coarse, dark flour she could afford when she had money. There was granulated sugar in glass jars, coffee beans that exuded a rich, intense aroma. There was even chocolate bars, a luxury her children had never tasted. The tears Carmen had held back until now finally fell, running freely down her thin, sun-baked face. It was enough food to feed her family for months, perhaps for an entire year. It was the difference between life and death, between watching her children starve or seeing them grow strong and healthy. Carmen began to grab the cans with trembling hands, filling the deep pockets of her faded calico skirt, taking everything she could carry. But then, as she moved a large sack of flour that lay on the floor covering part of the planks, she heard a hollow sound. One of the floorboards sounded different from the others when she stepped on it. It wasn't the solid sound of firmly nailed wood, but an empty sound, as if there was a space underneath. Carmen knelt, her heart racing again. Using the knife that she always carried tied to her waist, her only tool and weapon, began to pry at the plank. The wood yielded with a dull groan, revealing a dark, narrow compartment hollowed out in the ship's hull. It was a hiding place, a secret spot where someone had stored something too valuable to leave in plain sight. With hands trembling so much she could barely control her movements, Carmen plunged her hand into the dark hole. Her fingers touched something cold and smooth, polished wood. It was a box, heavy, the size of a shoebox, but much heavier. She pulled the box out of its hiding place and placed it on the kitchen floor, in the scant light filtering through the door. The box was made of dark wood, almost black, with golden metal details on the edges. It had no lock, just a simple clasp. Carmen's heart pounded so hard she thought it would explode. Her sweaty hands slipped on the clasp twice before she managed to open it. When she lifted the lid, she had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. It wasn't gold bars as she had imagined. It was something even more valuable, more portable, more dangerous. Jewels. The box was full of jewels that glittered even in the dim light of the ship's kitchen. Necklaces of enormous pearls, each pearl the size of a plump olive. Rings with green stones that seemed to capture the light and multiply it. Red stones that glowed like burning embers. Diamond earrings that looked like frozen drops of light. Elaborate brooches in the shape of flowers and animals, all studded with precious stones. Everything was wrapped in pieces of black velvet, carefully organized by hands that knew exactly the value of what they were guarding. It was the wealth of generations. It was more money than existed in the entire village where she lived, perhaps more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Carmen looked at her own hands, dirty and calloused hands with broken nails and sunspots, and felt a profound dizziness. This was not a blessing. It was a curse. It was the kind of treasure for which men would kill without hesitation, for which entire families were destroyed. Now the abandoned child's shoe, the smell of old blood on the silk sheets, and the fresh ink in the logbook made terrible and complete sense. This ship was not just abandoned, it was the scene of a crime. Someone had stolen these jewels. Someone had done something horrible here, and that someone was probably still nearby, waiting to return and reclaim their bloody prize. And what if that someone was Colonel Anthony? He had enough power to do anything, to kill anyone, to hide any crime. The entire village lived under his control. If he was involved in this, then she had just signed her own death warrant by setting foot on this ship. But even knowing this, even feeling the danger like a physical weight crushing her chest, Carmen couldn't just close the box and leave. Her children were starving. Peter cried from hunger every night until his voice was hoarse. Raphael was 11 but looked 8 from malnutrition. The girls had swollen bellies and arms thin as twigs. Before you find out what happened to Carmen and her impossible choices, I need to ask you something. If this story is touching your heart, if you're feeling the anguish of this desperate mother, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, honestly, what would you do in Carmen's place? If you found a treasure like this, knowing it was stolen, knowing it could be dangerous, but seeing your children dying of hunger in front of you, what would be your choice? Take it or leave it? Comment below because I really want to know what's going through your mind. Carmen made a decision in a fraction of a second, guided more by desperation than by reason. She couldn't take the whole box. It was too big, too heavy, impossible to hide. It would be an immediate death sentence if anyone saw her carrying it. But she also couldn't leave everything behind, couldn't waste this one chance that fate had placed in her path. Her trembling hand plunged into the black velvet, pushing aside a heavy emerald necklace. Her fingers searched for something small, something she could hide in her clothes, something she could sew into the lining of her dress or Peter's blanket. She found a ring, thick and heavy, with an enormous red stone at the center, surrounded by small diamonds that glittered like stars. A ruby, though she didn't know the correct name of the stone. She took the ring and squeezed it tightly in her clenched fist. The metal was cold as ice against her hot, sweaty skin. Quickly, almost violently, she tucked the ring inside her blouse, hiding it in the rough fabric that covered her breasts. The cold stone against her skin made her shiver, but she forced herself to ignore the sensation. That ring was her deadly secret, her sin and her salvation all at once. She closed the lid of the dark wooden box quickly, as if its contents might jump out and betray her. She put the box back into the hiding place under the floor and pushed the loose plank back into place. With her foot, she dragged the fallen sack of flour to cover any evidence that someone had tampered there. Her heart beat like a war drum, loud and too fast. She had committed a sin. She had stolen. She had become a thief. But what else could she do? God would judge her, but God wasn't there to feed Peter or Raphael or the girls. Carmen filled her arms with cans of food, grabbing Portuguese sardines, canned meat, condensed milk, peaches in syrup. everything she could hold. The weight was comforting, it was real, it was the promise of at least a few weeks without seeing her children cry from hunger. She also picked up the brown leather logbook she had left on a kitchen counter. Something told her that book was important, that the words written in it could be her protection or her ruin. She left the kitchen laden like a pack mule, crossed the main cabin again, avoiding looking at the child's shoe still lying on the luxurious carpet. Each step on that soft carpet felt like a sacrilege, as if she were desecrating a tomb. The air in the cabin was too heavy, too laden with the smell of blood and perfume. She needed to get out of there. She needed the clean air of the beach, even if it was the warm, salty air of dawn. She reached the deck and stopped, breathing deeply, filling her lungs with fresh air. The morning mist was beginning to dissipate, burned away by the rising sun on the horizon. The sky was turning a pale pink in the east, and visibility was improving rapidly. Carmen approached the edge of the ship, preparing to descend the rope ladder, mentally planning the quickest way back to her shack. She needed to get there before anyone saw her, before the questions started, before Colonel Anthony found out about the ship. She looked down at the beach, searching for the best spot to land on the soft sand. But the beach was not empty as she expected. Her heart stopped completely, frozen in her chest, as if it had turned to stone. There, standing on the wet sand just a few meters from the ship's hull, were 3 men. They weren't ordinary fishermen waking early for work. They were 3 still, menacing figures watching her with an unnatural calm. In the center, impossible not to recognize even from a distance, was Colonel Anthony. He wasn't surprised to see the ship there. He wasn't curious or scared. He was calm, with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his straw hat casting a shadow over his small, hard eyes. Beside him were Silent Joe and Knife-Face Bento, the 2 henchmen who carried out the dirty orders of the colonel without asking questions. Silent Joe wasn't truly mute, but he spoke so little that people had forgotten the sound of his voice. Bento had a deep scar that ran from his forehead to his chin, cutting his face in half, a souvenir from a machete fight he'd won by killing his opponent. They were dangerous men who had made other fishermen disappear at sea and whom no one in the village dared to report. The 3 of them stood there, waiting. They weren't surprised to see her. They were waiting for her, or for someone. The realization hit Carmen like a bucket of cold water. The ship hadn't arrived there by chance. The tide hadn't brought it by luck. Colonel Anthony knew the ship was here. Perhaps he himself had guided the ship into this sand trap. Perhaps he had done something terrible to the crew and passengers. And now she was the witness, the only person besides him who had seen the ship's interior, who had seen the child's shoe, who had found the diary. She was the rat that had fallen into the trap, and the cat was down there waiting to break her neck. The ring hidden in her blouse stopped being a hope and turned into a lead weight. The cans of food in her arms felt like anchors pulling her to the bottom of the sea. Colonel Anthony's voice cut through the morning air, calm and venomous. He didn't shout because he didn't need to. His calm was far more terrifying than any threat. "I knew hunger would bring you here, Carmen," he said, his voice reaching the ship's deck clearly. "A poor woman can't resist curiosity. There are things the sea brings, and it's better to let the sea take them back, understand? But you've always been too stubborn for your own good." Silent Joe and Knife-Faced Bento didn't move, remaining there like dark stone statues against the light sand, blocking any possibility of escape. Carmen felt her legs tremble, but she forced herself to stand. She wouldn't beg, she wouldn't fall to her knees, She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Colonel Anthony began to walk towards the rope ladder, his steps slow and deliberate on the wet sand. He was in no hurry, knowing she had nowhere to run. He began to climb, one step at a time, his heavy boots thudding against the hull's wood with a hollow sound that marked his approach like the ticking of a clock, counting the final seconds of Carmen's life. When he placed both feet on the deck, the ship seemed to sink a little deeper into the sand. Colonel Anthony was a large man, not fat, but dense and solid as hardwood, with broad shoulders and enormous hands that seemed capable of breaking bones effortlessly. He smelled of strong pipe tobacco, cheap rum, and that rancid scent of power from someone who had never been challenged in his entire life. His small, dark eyes swept the deck, noting the broken plates, the fallen crystal glasses, the overturned table, all that opulence and disarray. Then his eyes landed on Carmen and the cans of food she held against her chest like a useless shield. Carmen felt the icy weight of the ring against her skin. It was a burning ember of ice searing through her blouse's fabric, a secret screaming to be discovered. Her arms trembled holding the cans, and she hated this visible weakness, hated that her body betrayed her by showing her fear. "I just came for food, Colonel," she managed to say. "My children haven't eaten in days. The tide brought the ship. I thought no one would need these cans, that they were abandoned." She wanted to appear only the hungry widow, the desperate mother who posed no threat. She wanted her misery to be a shield, to make her seem too small, too insignificant to be a problem. But Colonel Anthony laughed, a dry, humorless laugh, like stones being crushed. "Abandoned?" he repeated, tasting the word as if it were something bitter. "Nothing here is abandoned, Carmen. Everything has an owner, and I am the owner. Everything the sea washes onto this beach is mine by right. You're stealing what's mine." He took a step towards her, and Carmen instinctively recoiled, but her back hit the cabin wall. There was nowhere to run on the narrow deck. Colonel Anthony's eyes shifted from her and fixed on the open door of the main cabin, the place she had just exited. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and something more. "Perhaps concern. And what else did you see in there, woman? Did you find anything interesting? Anything that shines?" His voice had dropped, becoming intimate and deadly. He knew exactly what was on the ship. He knew about the jewels. This wasn't a casual encounter. It was a calculated operation, and she had stumbled right into the middle of it. Colonel Anthony took another step towards the cabin, and Carmen moved without thinking, blocking the entrance with her lean body. It was an instinctive move, perhaps stupid, but she couldn't help it. Something inside her, some spark of dignity that refused to die, made her place herself between the colonel and that cabin full of bloody secrets. This small act of defiance completely changed the colonel's expression. The cruel amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, dangerous impatience. "Get out of the way, woman," he ordered, his voice dropping an octave, growing thicker and more threatening. "Don't make me move you by force." But Carmen, with the hunger of her children burning in her empty stomach and the sunset ultimatum weighing on her shoulders, felt something break inside her. The fear was still there, enormous and paralyzing, but now it was mixed with a rage she didn't even know she possessed. a rage against this man who controlled everything, who took everything, who broke families and lives without blinking. A rage against a world that let children starve while ships full of treasure appeared on the beaches. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with each word. "Yes, I found something." Her hands dropped the cans of food, which clattered onto the deck with a metallic clang that echoed through the morning silence. Her hands were free, except for one that held the brown leather logbook. She raised the book in the air, holding it like a weapon or a shield. "I found this," she said, her voice now firmer. "The captain's book. And there's a lot written in here. Your name is written in here." Colonel Anthony. The colonel's reaction was instantaneous and revealing. His entire body stiffened as if he'd been shot, his eyes fixed on the leather book with an intensity that bordered on panic. He took a step back involuntarily, and Carmen saw something she never thought she'd see: fear in that man's eyes. It wasn't fear of her, but fear of what that book represented. And then Carmen understood with absolute clarity. Colonel Anthony couldn't read. She saw it in the way he looked at the book, not as a source of information he could decipher, but as a mysterious and threatening object, a symbol of a power he didn't control. The written word was the weapon of the rich, the educated, of priests and lawyers, and now that weapon was in the hands of a poor widow he had completely underestimated. Carmen's fear didn't disappear, but it was tempered by a glacial clarity. She had found his weakness, the only vulnerable point in his armor of absolute power. The captain wrote everything. She lied, keeping her voice steady even as her heart pounded in her chest. "He wrote about you, about the agreement you made, about how you betrayed them." Each word was a stone thrown with deadly precision. She saw the colonel's dark skin grow even darker with the rage that climbed to his face. The word betrayed hung suspended between them like toxic smoke. He said nothing immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and dense, full of contained violence. Carmen knew he was calculating his options. He could kill her right there, throw her into the sea along with the book, make her body disappear as he had done with so many others. But what about her 5 children waiting in the shack? What if she had told someone? What if the book was just a copy and the original was hidden somewhere else? Doubt, for the first time in the life of a man accustomed to absolute certainties, had entered his mind. Carmen saw this doubt and seized it. She moved the book dangerously close to the edge of the deck, holding it over the gray water that gently slapped against the ship's hull. "I'll give you the ship, sir," she said, making her voice sound more confident than she felt. "Everything inside is yours, the jewels, the gold, whatever these rich folks were carrying." She made a vague gesture towards the cabin, as if she knew of additional treasures hidden throughout the ship. "But you leave my house in peace, forgive John's debt, and give me safe passage on the next cart heading to Port Cyprus, me and my 5 children." She brought the book even closer to the edge, over the gray abyss of the ocean. "Or I will burn this book page by page and tell every fisherman in the village what I read inside, and then I'll hand it over to the first government soldier who shows up here." The word soldier was chosen carefully. She didn't say federal or police, she said soldier, evoking the image of armed army men. Men who didn't answer to the colonel, men who came from outside and asked inconvenient questions. The silence that fell over the deck was so heavy it seemed solid. The only sound was the soft whistle of the wind that began to blow stronger with the rising sun and the constant murmur of the waves. Colonel Anthony stared at her fixedly, his dark eyes now without the casual arrogance they always held. He was calculating, weighing his options, measuring how much risk she truly represented. Carmen wasn't breathing. Every muscle in her body was taut like a guitar string about to snap. The book in her hand trembled visibly, but she kept her arm extended over the water, ready to release it if he made any sudden move towards her. She saw the absolute fury in the colonel's clenched jaw, the muscle twitching rhythmically beneath skin weathered by sun and wind. He hated her in that moment, hated being cornered, hated that a woman with nothing had managed to put him in a position of weakness. His enormous hands closed into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. She knew he wanted that book, wanted to rip it from her hands and break her neck right there, throw her into the sea, and say the ghost ship had taken her, another victim of the cursed coast. But he couldn't do that. Carmen had been too clever, or too desperate, and sometimes those two things are exactly the same. The word soldier had planted a seed of real fear in his mind. Soldiers brought investigations. They brought uniformed officers who didn't bow to local power. And the betrayal of a rich family from the capital, that was a completely different matter from making a poor fisherman like John disappear. That brought attention, the kind of attention even a powerful colonel didn't want. Slowly, as if each movement cost a piece of his soul, Colonel Anthony nodded. It was an almost imperceptible movement, just a slight tilt of his head. But for Carmen, it was like seeing the sun rise after the longest night of her life. "All right," he grumbled, his voice like stones dragged over broken glass. "Give me the book and get out of my sight. You have until sunset to get on the cart going to Port Cyprus. Take your brats and go. But if I see you on this beach tomorrow morning when the sun rises, the deal is off, and you'll know the bottom of the sea just like your husband did." The threat was real and specific, and Carmen felt a cold shiver run down her spine. But she didn't move the book. Fear had made her smarter than she had ever been. "No," she said, and saw genuine surprise flash in the colonel's eyes. "The book stays with me. I'll give it to the cart driver when my 5 children and I are seated in the cart and far from the village. If anything happens to us, if we don't arrive in that cart, he has orders to take the book directly to the capital's barracks." It was a lie built upon another lie. A tower of deceptions erected solely on pure desperation. There was no cart driver waiting, no secret agreement, no plan at all beyond surviving the next few hours. But the lie sounded convincing, even to her own ears, perhaps because she truly believed she was capable of doing it if she needed to. Colonel Anthony looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in his life, Carmen saw something akin to respect cross his face. It was the respect a predator has for another predator, the recognition that she was more dangerous than he had imagined. He let out a short laugh that sounded more like a hoarse bark. "You're more snake than I thought, Carmen. Your mother should have drowned you when you were born. It would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." But he stepped aside, clearing the way to the rope ladder with a wide, mocking gesture. "So go," he said. "Take your beggar's food and get off my ship. And take that cursed book with you. But remember, woman, I have eyes everywhere. If you open your mouth to anyone, if you say anything more than good morning and good afternoon, I'll know. And when I know, no book will save you. Your children will grow up without a mother, just like they grew up without a father." Carmen didn't answer. She didn't trust her own voice not to tremble and reveal the terror she felt. Keeping her eyes fixed on the colonel, she slowly bent down and began to collect the cans of food she had dropped, stuffing them into the deep pockets of her skirt. With the heavy logbook tucked under her arm and pressed against her body, she began to walk backward toward the rope ladder, never taking her eyes off the colonel. Descending was an agony of seconds that felt like hours. Each rung of the rope ladder was an eternity. Her hands slipped on the rough rope, sweaty with fear. The cans were heavy, the book an awkward burden, and she expected at any second to feel the colonel's hands grabbing her hair or a knife entering her back. When her bare feet finally touched the wet, firm sand of the beach, she felt such profound relief that her knees almost gave out. But she couldn't stop, couldn't show weakness. She began to walk quickly towards her shack, without looking back, without running, because running would be admitting defeat and fear. She had managed only 20 steps when she heard a violent crash behind her, the sound of wood splintering, and an animalistic roar of fury. She couldn't resist and looked over her shoulder. Colonel Anthony, in a fit of frustrated rage, had kicked the deck table with such force that it shattered. Pieces of expensive wood and porcelain plates flew in all directions. Silent Joe and Knife-Face Bento were now climbing onto the ship, carrying iron bars and heavy tools. "Find it," Colonel Anthony roared, his voice no longer calm and controlled, but a wild bellow of hatred. "Tear this cursed ship apart plank by plank if you have to. I want the jewels. I want everything of value here." Carmen quickened her pace, almost running now, her heart beating so fast she thought it would explode. The ring hidden in her blouse burned against her skin like a hot coal. He was looking for the jewels she had never mentioned. He would destroy the entire ship searching for the treasure he believed was wholly his, unaware that she had stolen one piece, the most valuable and portable one, the key to her family's freedom. The colonel thought he had won, that he had scared the foolish widow into fleeing with a few cans of food. He didn't know she was taking much more than that. She was taking their future, taking the possibility of starting anew far from here, far from his reach. The way back to the shack was a blur of fear and adrenaline. The fog had completely disappeared now, and the harsh morning light exposed every miserable detail of the coast. The black, sharp rocks that looked like a giant's rotten teeth. The shacks scattered like wounds in the sand. Every shadow seemed like one of the colonel's men waiting to ambush her. Every sound made her jump. When she finally saw the crooked door of her shack, Carmen felt hot tears rolling down her dirty face. She pushed the door open hard, stumbled inside, and closed it behind her, locking it with the rotten log they used as a bolt. Her 5 children woke up startled by the abrupt entry, their little eyes wide with fear and confusion. Carmen leaned against the rough clay wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly, the logbook falling to the packed dirt floor with a dull thud. She opened her skirt and let the cans of food fall. They rolled across the dirt floor, clattering metal against stone. The 5 children let out muffled cries of joy and surprise. Sardines, peaches and syrup, canned meat, condensed milk. It was more food than they had seen in months. Raphael, the eldest, grabbed a can of peaches and started trying to open it by hitting it against a stone. The others crowded around, their dirty little hands outstretched, their mouths open in anticipation. But Carmen couldn't join their joy. Her hand instinctively went to her blouse, where the ruby ring was hidden, pressing against the cold stone to make sure it was still there. It was real. Everything had been real. She had stolen, she had lied, she had defied the most powerful man in the region, and somehow she had survived. But surviving the morning didn't mean surviving the day. The colonel had given her until sunset. She had perhaps 10 hours, maybe less, to gather her children and leave here forever. Raphael finally managed to pierce the can of peaches using a sharp stone, and the sweet syrup began to trickle out. The children plunged their dirty hands into the can, pulling out pieces of soft golden fruit, licking the thick syrup, their faces transforming with a pleasure they had forgotten existed. It was the first time in over a year they had eaten anything sweet. Anything that wasn't just watery flour or rotten fish. Frances, the 7-year-old girl, had tears streaming down her thin cheeks as she chewed slowly, savoring each piece as if it were her last. Carmen watched, feeling an immense knot in her throat. This was why she had risked everything. It was for these moments of relief on her children's faces, for these tears of joy instead of tears of pain. But there was no time for sentimentality. There was no time to savor this small victory. "Raphael," she said, and her voice cracked like a whip. "Stop eating now. All of you, stop. Save that food." The joy on the children's faces died instantly, replaced by confusion and fear. Carmen knelt on the dirt floor and began stuffing the remaining cans into 2 old jute sacks they used for carrying firewood. "We don't have time," she explained, trying to keep her voice calm, even though her heart was pounding. "We need to get out of here. Now. Today. We're leaving this village, and we're never coming back." "Mom? Where are we going?" Raphael asked, his 11-year-old eyes suddenly looking much older and scared. He knew something serious had happened, something that had changed everything. "Far away," Carmen simply replied. "To a place where no one knows us, to a place where you'll be able to eat every day and sleep without fear." She had no idea if such a place existed, but she needed to believe it did. She needed to believe there was something better waiting beyond this miserable coast. She began gathering her possessions, which were almost nothing. The rough wooden platforms where they slept would stay. The cracked clay pot, too. They couldn't carry anything that wasn't essential. She picked up the small statuette of St. Anthony that had belonged to her grandmother, the only thing of sentimental value she possessed, and tucked it into her blouse along with the ruby ring. The rough wood of the statuette and the cold metal of the jewel touched against her skin, one representing faith, the other representing sin, both equally necessary for her survival. "Frances, you will carry Peter on your back," Carmen ordered, tying the 10-month-old baby to the 7-year-old girl's back with an old cloth. Peter was too quiet, too weak, his big eyes not focusing properly. Carmen prayed that the food they had just eaten would give him enough strength to endure the journey. "Raphael, you carry one sack. I'll carry the other. Audrey and Daisy, both of you walk between us and don't let go of my skirt for anything. Understood?" The children nodded, their pale, serious faces. They knew when the situation was serious. They had learned to read the fear in their mother's eyes. Carmen picked up the logbook from the floor and stuffed it into the sack along with the cans. It was heavy and useless, but it was also her only protection, her only bargaining chip if the colonel changed his mind and decided to hunt them down. They left the shack in a line, a sad procession of refugees. Carmen didn't even look back. She left the door open, swinging in the wind blowing from the sea. That place had been her home, the place where she had been happy with John, where her children had been born. But now it was just a prison from which she was finally escaping. The path from the shack to the main road was treacherous, more of a goat trail than a real path, winding through thorny coastal vegetation and exposed roots. Carmen went first, clearing the way, carrying a heavy sack of cans and the even heavier weight of fear. Raphael came behind, carrying the other sack and holding 3-year-old Daisy's hand. 5-year-old Audrey clung to Carmen's skirt with desperate fingers. Frances brought up the rear, carrying Peter on her back, the baby swaying with each of his sister's stumbling steps. Every noise made Carmen freeze, expecting to see Silent Joe or Knife-Face Bento emerge from the trees. Each time a bird flew from the bushes, her heart leaped to her throat. She knew the colonel might have changed his mind, might have decided it was safer to kill her and take the book by force. He might have sent his henchmen to follow them and do the dirty work away from the village's sight. The sun was rising fast now, turning the morning into a furnace. The heat was brutal, weighing on them like a hot, wet blanket. The children began to complain, their weak voices asking for water. But Carmen couldn't stop. Every minute they spent near the village was another minute of danger. They had to reach the main road. They had to find a wagon or a cart to take them far from here. Michael, the 4-year-old boy, stumbled on an exposed root and fell face first into the muddy ground. He started to cry, a loud, frightened sob. Carmen pulled him up with a sharp tug, perhaps sharper than she intended, and wiped his face with the hem of her skirt. "Stop crying," she hissed, her voice harsher than she wanted. "We can't make noise. Bad people are looking for us. Do you want them to find us?" The boy swallowed his sobs, his eyes filled with silent tears that streamed down, leaving clean trails on her dirty face. Carmen felt a pang of guilt, but she couldn't allow herself to be soft now. Softness was a luxury she couldn't afford. They kept walking, one step at a time, through the suffocating heat and hostile vegetation. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably just an hour, they finally reached the main road. It was little more than a dirt track, full of potholes and rocks, but it was the only link between their forgotten village and the rest of the world. Carmen stopped in the shade of a large tree, letting the children rest for a moment. They collapsed onto the ground like rag dolls, exhausted, sweaty, covered in dust. Peter was sleeping or unconscious on Francis's back, his small body limp and frighteningly quiet. Carmen placed her hand on his tiny chest and felt his heart beating, faint but steady. He was alive. All of them were alive, for now. Now they had to wait for a cart, a wagon, any vehicle that would pass and agree to take them to Port Cyprus. Carmen had no money for passage, but she had the ring. She could try to negotiate, she could beg, she could do whatever was necessary. The sun kept rising, and the heat became increasingly oppressive. Hours dragged on. The children alternated between napping in the shade and complaining of thirst and heat. Carmen kept vigil on the empty road, her eyes fixed on the dusty horizon, searching for any sign of movement. And then, when the sun was almost directly overhead, she saw it. A cloud of dust in the distance, growing, approaching. A vehicle was coming down the road. Carmen jumped up, her heart pounding. "Wake up," she ordered the children. "Get up now. Someone's coming." They stumbled to their feet, confused and sleepy. Carmen positioned them at the side of the road, making sure they were visible. She needed whoever was driving that vehicle to see them. She needed them to stop. As the vehicle approached, she could make out the details. It was an old wagon pulled by 2 skinny oxen, loaded with sacks of something, probably flour or sugar, heading to the capital. The driver was an old, sun-baked man with a straw hat so old it was practically falling apart. Carmen stood in the middle of the road, forcing the wagon to stop or run her over. She raised her hands in a gesture of supplication. "Please, sir," she cried, her voice cracked from thirst and despair. "Please stop." The man pulled the oxen's reins, and the wagon slowed to a complete halt in a cloud of red dust. He looked at Carmen and the 5 children behind her with an expression of suspicion and irritation. "What do you want, woman?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I'm in a hurry, don't have time for chatter." "I need you to take us to Port Cyprus," Carmen pleaded, feeling tears sting her eyes. "Me and my children." "We have nowhere left to stay here." The old man frowned, his small eyes scanning the miserable group. "Widow, aren't you?" he said, more in assertion than a question. "You're running from something." Carmen didn't deny it. There was no way to deny it. "Were you in debt? Did you take something you shouldn't have?" Carmen hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "The colonel of the village wants my land. He threatened to drive me out. I just want to leave here and start over somewhere else." The old man spat to the side, a thick brown gob of chewing tobacco. I know people like that, Colonel. The land's full of 'em. But I don't work for free, woman. Port Cypress is far. It'll cost me a whole day's journey. Can you pay?" Carmen reached inside her blouse, her fingers finding the cold ring. For a moment, she hesitated. This ring was all they had. It was the secret that could destroy or save them. But she looked at her children, at their small, sun-baked faces and empty bellies, and knew she had no choice. She pulled the ruby ring out, holding it in her open palm, where it glowed with an inner fire even under the harsh midday sun. The old man looked at the ring, and his eyes widened. He leaned forward on the wagon seat, completely forgetting the hurry he had mentioned moments before. "Holy Christ, woman," he murmured, his voice changing completely in tone. "Where did you get that? That's a real ruby. That's worth a fortune." Carmen quickly closed her hand around the ring, hiding it from view. "It was my grandmother's," she lied, the lie coming surprisingly easily from her lips. "It's the only thing of value I have. Take us to Port Cypress and it's yours." The old man looked at her for a long moment, his suspicious eyes scanning her face for signs of deceit. Carmen knew how she must look, a ragged widow with 5 hungry children, holding a ring worth more than everything she could earn in 10 lifetimes of labor. The story made no sense, and the old man knew it. But greed is a powerful motivator, and that ring was worth far more than any load of flour he was transporting. "All right," he said finally, making his decision. "But if you're pulling a fast one on me, if someone's coming after you because of this stolen ring, I'll throw all of you out at the first bend in the road. Understand?" "I understand," Carmen agreed quickly, relief flooding her body like cold water. "No one's coming after us, I swear on my dead husband's soul." "Then get in the back and stay quiet. I don't want to hear a peep from those children until we arrive." Carmen helped the children climb into the back of the wagon among the heavy sacks of flour. They were rough jute sacks that smelled of mold and old grain, but for them, it was like lying on clouds. Raphael helped pull the younger sisters up, while Carmen passed Peter, who was still unconscious or sleeping. When all the children were settled among the sacks, Carmen climbed in last, her muscles protesting with the effort. The old man cracked the whip at the oxen, and the wagon began to move with a jolt, the wheels creaking and groaning over the bumpy road. Each lurch was painful. Every pothole the wheels found made everyone shake violently. But Carmen didn't care. They were moving. They were getting away from the village, getting away from Colonel Anthony and his murderous henchmen, getting away from that cursed coast that had taken her husband and almost taken her children too. She turned to look back one last time, seeing the green line of the coast grow smaller and smaller on the dusty horizon. The white ship, the Morning Star, must still have been there, beached on the sand, being torn apart plank by the colonel's men, desperately searching for the treasure they would never find complete, because one piece, the most valuable piece, was here with her, hidden again in her blouse. Carmen allowed herself a small, bitter smile. She had won. Against all odds. Against a man who controlled everything, she had won. It wasn't a glorious victory. It wasn't something she could proudly tell about. It was a dirty victory, built on theft and lies and despair. But it was a victory nonetheless, and it was hers. The journey to Port Cypress took the entire day and part of the night. The sun crossed the sky slowly, cooking them in the back of the open wagon. The children alternated between restless sleep and complaining of thirst and hunger. Carmen opened one of the cans of sardines she had stolen from the ship and divided the oily contents among the 5 hungry mouths. It wasn't much, but it was something. Peter finally woke up and cried for milk she didn't have to give. Frances, with her infinite patience as an older sister, chewed pieces of sardine until they were soft, and placed them in the baby's mouth, who sucked them eagerly. The sun began to set, painting the sky with brilliant oranges and pinks. Colors so beautiful they seemed to mock their misery. Carmen watched the sunset through her tears. She had escaped. The colonel's deadline had been until sunset, and when the sun finally drowned in the horizon, she was miles away, out of his reach, free from his grasp. "John," she whispered to the darkening sky, speaking to the ghost of her dead husband. "We made it. I saved them. I hope you're proud of me, even knowing how I managed it. I hope you understand I had no choice." Night fell completely, and the old man lit a kerosene lantern that swayed at the front of the cart, casting dancing shadows on the road ahead. The stars began to appear, thousands of them dotting the black sky like spilled silver. Carmen had never seen so many stars. In the village, with the ocean ever present, the sky seemed smaller somehow. But here, inland, traveling deserted roads through fields and forests, the sky seemed infinite. Finally, when the moon was high and most of the children had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Carmen saw lights in the distance. They were the lights of Port Cyprus, faint and scattered, but unmistakable. Civilization, a real city, not just a forgotten village controlled by a local tyrant. The old man stopped the cart on the outskirts of the city, in an area where other carters camped for the night. "End of the line, woman," he announced, his voice tired. "Port Cyprus is right there. From here on, you're on your own." Carmen got down from the cart with difficulty, her legs numb after hours sitting in the same position. She helped the children down one by one, taking Peter from Francis and holding him against her chest. The baby was too hot, feverish, and she prayed it was just the heat of the day and not some worse illness. The old man held out his hand, waiting. "The ring," he reminded her, bluntly. "We had a deal." Carmen took the ring from her blouse for the second time that day. For a moment, she held it tight, feeling its weight, the weight of everything it represented, everything she had risked to get it. Then, with a quick movement before she could change her mind, she placed it in the old man's rough palm. He held the ring up to the dim lantern light, examining it from all angles, his eyes gleaming with greed and satisfaction. "It's really real," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's worth more than this cart and these oxen combined. It'll give me a comfortable old age, it will." He tucked the ring into the deep pocket of his soiled trousers and looked at Carmen with something that might have been pity. "Good luck, woman. You'll need it. A widow with 5 children and not a penny to her name in a city she doesn't know. It'll be tough, but you seem like the type who can handle tough things." Carmen didn't answer. She picked up the 2 jute sacks with the remaining cans of food, handed one to Raphael to carry, and held the other herself. She gathered her children around her like a hen gathering chicks and began to walk towards the city lights. She didn't look back, didn't thank the old man, simply walked forward because it was the only direction left. Port Cyprus was larger than anything Carmen had seen. Even on the outskirts, even in the poor periphery where they arrived, there were more houses, more people, more noise than existed in her entire village. The streets were dirt roads, but some were wide enough for 2 carts to pass side by side. There were street vendors even at this late hour of the night, selling black-eyed pea fritters and tapioca flatbreads from carts lit by lanterns. The smell of fried food made Carmen's stomach rumble violently, and the children looked with hungry, anxious eyes. But Carmen didn't have a cent. She had given everything of value she possessed for the transport here. They found shelter that first night under the awning of a closed church. Carmen spread the jute sacks on the cold stone floor and laid her children on them, covering them with her own bodies to keep them warm. She opened a can of peaches and syrup and divided the contents among them all, each child receiving only a few pieces of soft fruit and a sip of sweet syrup. It wasn't enough to fill their bellies, but it was enough to quell their hunger enough for them to sleep. Carmen didn't sleep that night. She stayed awake, sitting with her back against the cold church wall, holding Peter in her lap. The baby had a high fever now, his small body burning like an ember. She wet a piece of cloth with water from a nearby public fountain and wiped his forehead, trying to bring down his temperature. She prayed to all the saints she knew, promised anything, everything, if only they would let her baby live. Tears streamed silently down her face as she cradled Peter, softly singing the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her when she was small. When the sun rose the next day, painting the sky pink and gold, Peter was a little better. The fever had subsided, and he could open his eyes and look at her. Carmen kissed his damp forehead repeatedly, murmuring thanks to a divinity she wasn't sure was listening. The following days were a struggle for survival in a city that didn't want them. Carmen sought work, knocking door to door, offering her services to wash clothes, clean houses, cook, anything. Most doors closed in her face when they saw she had 5 children depending on her. Who would hire a widow with so much baggage? But finally, in a large house in the city center, the owner, an elderly and devout lady, took pity on her. She offered laundry work in exchange for a miserable wage, but at least it was something. She also offered a small room at the back of the property where Carmen and her children could live. It was a tiny room, barely bigger than a closet, with a roof that leaked when it rained and walls as thin as paper. But it had a door that locked, it had a cement floor instead of dirt, and it was far from the reach of Colonel Anthony. It was enough. The months passed slowly. Carmen worked from 5 in the morning until 9 at night, her hands constantly plunged in cold water and caustic soap until they were cracked and bleeding. Raphael found work as a delivery boy in a bakery, running through the streets of Port Cyprus with fresh bread balanced in a basket on his head. The money he earned was little, but it helped. The girls looked after Peter during the day, taking turns carrying him when he cried, feeding him thin porridge that Carmen prepared before leaving for work. Life was hard, perhaps harder than it had been in the village, but there was a fundamental difference. Here, they were free. No one owned them. No one threatened to evict them if they couldn't pay impossible debts. No one controlled every aspect of their lives. Freedom, Carmen discovered, had a bitter but precious taste. And at night, when all the children were asleep, huddled like pups in the small, stuffy room, Carmen took the logbook from its hiding place under a loose floorboard. She had never managed to get anyone to read the complete book to her. Raphael could only read the basics, and she didn't trust anyone else with that secret. But sometimes she would open the book to the last page, where the captain's desperate handwriting recorded the final moments before the tragedy. She traced the letters with her finger, imagining the words, imagining the full story she would never know. There was also the shoe, the small black leather shoe she had grabbed from the ship's cabin at the last moment, an impulse she didn't fully understand. She kept the shoe wrapped in a cloth at the bottom of her only clothing trunk. Sometimes she would take it out and look at it, imagining the child who had worn it. Was it a boy or a girl? How old would they have been? Where would they be now? Would they be alive? Hidden somewhere with their rich parents who had fled through the jungle? Or would they have met the same fate as John, swallowed by the relentless sea? Carmen would never know, but keeping that shoe seemed important somehow. It was a reminder that there were always bigger stories, greater tragedies than her own. It was a reminder that wealth protected no one from the cruelty of the world, that everyone, rich or poor, was vulnerable to fate and the malice of men. A year passed, then 2. Life in Port Cypress never became easy, but it became possible. The children grew. Raphael, at 13, was almost a man, now working in a textile factory, earning a small but steady wage. Frances, at 9, helped Carmen with the laundry, her small but nimble hands scrubbing stubborn stains. The other children also contributed in any way they could, selling fruit on the street, carrying groceries for wealthy ladies, doing odd jobs. Peter, miraculously, survived the dangerous early years and was growing into a healthy, noisy 3-year-old boy. And then, on a common afternoon of a common day, almost 3 years after that morning on the beach when Carmen had found the ghost ship, something extraordinary happened. Carmen was at the wash basin behind the big house, scrubbing a stained sheet against the rough stone, when she heard agitated voices coming from the street. It was unusual because that neighborhood was normally quiet during the day. Curious, she dried her hands on her wet apron and went to the gate to see what was happening. There was a group of people gathered around a man mounted on a lean horse. The man was distributing flyers, printed papers that he handed to anyone who could read. Carmen approached, staying on the periphery of the group. She couldn't read well enough to decipher the flyers, but she heard people commenting among themselves. "It's about that case from Bayou Bend," one woman was saying to another. "That rich family that disappeared 3 years ago, it seems they finally found the ship." Carmen felt her blood run cold. Her heart began to pound so hard that she thought everyone around could hear it. She moved closer, trying to listen better without seeming suspiciously interested. "What happened to them?" another person asked. "Dead," the man on the horse replied solemnly. "All dead, the entire family. The captain, the crew, they were murdered by bandits who wanted the jewels they were transporting. They found the bodies buried in the jungle, not far from where the ship was found beached." Carmen had to lean against the nearest stone wall, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. So it was true. Everyone was dead. The child of the shoe was dead. The captain who had written in the diary was dead. All had been murdered out of greed, the same greed she had felt when she reached into that jewelry box and took the ring. "And the killer?" someone in the crowd asked. "Did they catch who did it?" The man on the horse shook his head. "They say it was a local colonel, a certain Colonel Anthony. But when the government soldiers went to arrest him, he had disappeared. Fled to the wilderness, it seems. Or perhaps to the back country. No one knows. But the reward for the family's ruby ring is still valid. It's a very specific, valuable jewel. If anyone tries to sell it, they'll be caught immediately." Carmen's world spun violently. The ring. The ring she had stolen and given to that old cart driver. The ring that had bought her freedom and the lives of her children. It was wanted. It was evidence of a horrible crime. What if the old man had tried to sell it? What if he had been caught? What if, at this very moment, soldiers were looking for her, following the trail of the ring back to the widow with 5 children who had appeared in Port Cypress from nowhere? Carmen stumbled away from the crowd, returning to the wash basin in a state of shock. Her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the soap. She had to think. She had to decide what to do. Should she disappear again? Take the children and flee to another city, always running, always looking over her shoulder? Or should she stay quiet, pray that the old man had never tried to sell the ring, or if he had, that he would never connect it back to her? But then, as she mechanically scrubbed the sheet against the stone, Carmen had a realization that hit her with the force of a wave. The old man didn't know her name. He didn't know exactly where she came from. She had only said she was from a village in Bayou Bend, but she hadn't specified which one. She hadn't given details. And she was just another poor widow with children, indistinguishable from thousands of others throughout the Gulf Coast. Unless someone specifically looked for her, Unless Colonel Anthony had somehow survived and denounced her, she was safe. She was just another needle in a huge haystack. That night, after all the children were asleep, Carmen took the logbook from its hiding place. She looked at it for a long time, feeling the weight of the leather in her hands. This book was dangerous. It contained information that could destroy her if it fell into the wrong hands. But it was also the only proof of what had really happened on that ship, the only voice of the victims. Carmen couldn't read well enough to understand everything written there, but she knew it was important. She made a decision. The next morning, on her day off, she took the diary and walked to the police captain's office in downtown Port Cypress. Her heart beat like a drum as she waited in a line of people with complaints and reports. When it was finally her turn, she placed the diary on the officer's desk, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and tired eyes. "I found this," she said simply. "I think it belongs to that family who was murdered in Bayou Bend. I found it on a beach 3 years ago." I couldn't read what was written, but now I know it might be important. The officer picked up the book, opening it and flipping through the pages with growing interest. His eyes widened when he reached the last entry, the desperate handwriting mentioning names and betrayal. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp and suspicious. "The tide brought it to the beach near my house," Carmen replied, keeping her voice steady and her eyes direct. "I was a widow with children to feed. I picked up some cans of food I found. I didn't know there were dead people. I thought the ship had been abandoned. When I saw this book, I kept it, but I didn't know what to do with it. Now that I know the story, I'm turning it in." The officer studied her for a long moment, looking for signs of lies. Carmen maintained a neutral, humble expression, the perfect mask of the simple countrywoman who had stumbled upon something bigger than herself. Finally, the officer nodded. "You did the right thing bringing this here," he said. "This book could be the evidence we need to catch the rest of the culprits. There will be a small reward. You can come pick it up next week." Carmen shook her head. "I don't need a reward, sir. I just wanted to do the right thing. I just wanted these people to rest in peace." And before he could ask more questions, before the mask could slip, she left the office, walking quickly through the busy streets of Port Cypress until she disappeared into the anonymous crowd. That night, Carmen slept better than she had in 3 years. The weight of the diary, the weight of the secret, had finally lifted from her shoulder, friends. She had done what she could for the victims of the ship. It wasn't much. It didn't bring anyone back to life, but it was something. It was a small act of justice in a world that rarely offered any justice at all. The years kept passing. Carmen aged quickly, as all poor women do. Her face becoming lined by the sun and hard labor, her hands permanently twisted by decades of arthritis from washing clothes in cold water. But her children grew strong and healthy. Raphael became a supervisor at the textile factory, earning enough money to rent a small house where the whole family could live more comfortably. Frances married a good and honest carpenter and gave Carmen her first grandchildren. The other children also found their paths, building lives that were humble but dignified. Peter, the baby who had almost died that first night in Port Cypress, grew into a tall, strong man who worked on the docks carrying heavy sacks, his muscular body a testament to how far they had come from that life of constant hunger. And Carmen, in her old age, sat on the porch of the small house she now called home and watched her children and grandchildren playing in the dirt yard, and she knew it had been worth it. Every lie she had told, every law she had broken, every sin she had committed on that foggy morning 3 decades ago, it had all been worth it because it had resulted in this life, in this family surviving and prospering against all odds. She never told anyone the full story of the ship. She took that secret with her to the grave. But sometimes, when she was alone, she would take the small black leather shoe from its hiding place, now cracked and faded by time, and hold it with reverence. She prayed for the soul of the child who had worn it, for the family that had been destroyed by greed. She asked for forgiveness for what she had done, even knowing she would do it all again if necessary. Because in the end, Carmen's story wasn't about the ghost ship or the stolen jewels or the murderous colonel. It was about a mother doing the impossible to save her children. It was about survival in its rawest, most desperate form. It was about finding light in the deepest darkness, even when that light came from a blood-stained source. The ship had changed her life forever. It hadn't made her rich, but it had given her something more precious than wealth. It had given her a chance to start over. It had given her the freedom to choose her own destiny instead of having her destiny chosen by cruel and powerful men. And in the end, when Carmen finally closed her eyes for the last time, at 72 years old, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who loved her, she left with a smile on her lips. She had won. Against a world that did its best to crush people like her, she had won. The true treasure was never the jewels. It was never the ruby ring that bought her passage to freedom. The true treasure was always her children. It was always the family she protected tooth and nail. It was always the fierce and unwavering love of a mother who refused to give up even when all seemed lost. This was the story of the widow and the ghost ship. It wasn't a beautiful or comfortable story. It was a story about impossible choices and the desperate courage needed to make them. It was a story about the price of survival and about how sometimes doing the right thing means breaking all the rules. And now, after hearing this incredible journey of Carmen, I want to ask you an important question. What did this story teach you? For me, it shows that true strength doesn't come from muscles or money, but from the determination to protect those we love, even when the whole world conspires against us. It shows that sometimes survival demands things from us that we never thought we were capable of doing. If this story touched your heart in any way, if you felt Carmen's struggle as if it were your own struggle, I ask you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what moment of the story stood out to you the most. Was it when Carmen confronted the colonel on the ship's deck? Was it when she handed over the ring to ensure her children's escape? Was it when she finally handed the diary to the authorities? Or was it another moment that made you stop and think? And if you have a similar story, a story of overcoming impossible odds, a story about making difficult choices to protect your family, share it with us below. Our community is made up of real people with real stories, and every shared story is a light that can illuminate the path of someone going through difficult times right now. Sometimes we need to remember that we are not alone, that other people have faced terrible storms and come out on the other side, scarred but alive, hurt but victorious. So don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to start over, that it's possible to win even when all seems lost. Carmen's story happened almost 100 years ago, but the courage she showed is timeless. It's universal. It's something that resonates in each of us who has had to fight for something important. Thank you for watching until the end. Your presence here means the world to me. See you in the next video. And remember, no matter how dark the night seems, dawn always comes for those who refuse to give up.